Hello everybody. Today I want to talk to you about Rhizome by Deleuze and Guattari. I'm showing you this because it was first published as an independent book in 1976 and only later in 1980 as the introductory chapter in A Thousand Plateaus. So I thought about this book because I was listening to a reading group done by Acid Horizon that's only available to patrons on their Patreon account, and that inspired me to have a look again at the book. Probably it's worthwhile being a patron of Acid Horizon because they're doing interesting stuff, and it's only the basic level where you get access to these videos for the reading groups is only €1 a month, so it's really cheap. I decided that I wanted to say something about Rhizome. I don't know if I can do the whole book. So, as you see, it's quite thin. Goes up to page 74 in this edition, but it starts on page 7, and it's not tiny writing. So I want to use it not to, as they say, you shouldn't try and interpret works, although they're not superego, so they say don't interpret it, experiment. I'm not sure that they really obey their own precepts, and there's no reason to take them for some sort of Oedipal authority. So I see no problem in trying to interpret the book, but I want to sort of read it, interpret it, try it out, so experiment what it can do today for philosophizing today. It came out in 1976. Obviously, things have changed, the world has changed, and lots of other books and articles and texts and blogs and videos and so on have come out, so that what was pretty unique in 1976 may not be so unique today, in what is for me the interesting sense that if it's unique, it's sort of like a monologue, even if there are two authors. And if we see it in the context of today, it may be in dialogue with all sorts of other things. So its sense, although there we're interpreting if we say sense, has undoubtedly changed, maybe for the better. So I'm going to start off with some really basic remarks. First, just on the cover, we have the two authors, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. We have in big capital letters Rhizome, and in tiny capital letters introduction. So the important title is Rhizome. The secondary title is introduction, but we don't know to what, because A Thousand Plateaus only came out in 1980, so could have been just an introductory book to the concept of the rhizome at that stage. When we see it in as the first chapter in A Thousand Plateaus, we see there's a number before it, 1, Introduction, oddly enough, well, there are a couple of differences with respect to the other chapters in the book. Oddly enough, the I of introduction is not capitalized, whereas the first word, the first letter of the first word for all the other chapters is capitalized, and it's rhizome that is with the first word, with the first letter, the R, capitalized. So, and there's no date when they go out of their way to say that everything is dated. And it's important that everything has a date, and everything in fact has several dates. I've talked about the date of 1975 for the independent book version. There's also the date of 1980 when it's published as the introductory chapter to 1,000 Plateaus. And the date today, this is, what date is it? It's the 11th of February, 2022. So we've got all those dates, and each chapter in the book has a date to it, except this one. So it's sort of given what? A decontextualized status, de-datized, a primacy in some way. In the preface to 1,000 Plateaus, I'll translate it rather than read the translation. They go on about the order in which things should be read. Obviously, Rhizome was published before the other chapters, although a couple of chapters were published as articles before, so it will be interesting to see in what order things actually came out. Anyhow, this book is the sequel and the end of Capitalism and Schizophrenia. So in the English translation, I think they say this is the companion volume, but it's the sequel, and the first volume is Anti-Oedipus. So we can say 1,000 Plateaus is the sequel to Anti-Oedipus, or Anti-Oedipus is the prequel to 1,000 Plateaus. So we have a prequel and a sequel, and they go on. It's not composed of chapters. So here we're talking about 1,000 Plateaus. It's not composed of chapters, but of plateaus, in inverted commas. Already we get the double talk of Deleuze and Guattari. From the very beginning in Anti-Oedipus, they say, they talk about desiring machines, and they say this is not a metaphor. So one can wonder, if it's not a metaphor, what is it? Some people have taken them literally, and have taken the idea that it's not a metaphor literally, and have decided to interpret the book as being literal and not metaphorical. And that leads to some rather strange conclusions. And I think it's best to say that it's not a metaphor, desiring machines or plateaus or rhizome. They're not metaphors, only in the sense that Deleuze and Guattari want to speak outside of certain sorts of binary oppositions. So the opposition between metaphor and literal, metaphorical and literal, is something they don't want want to fall into, because it cuts off all sorts of lines of thought, and it cuts off, in fact, our power to conceptualize, because our concepts, if we follow Deleuze and Guattari, are at the same time images with a whole dramaturgy or cinematics. So one could say, well, if Designing Machine, if Plato's, if Rhizome is not a metaphor, it's not just they're not just concepts in the ordinary binary oppositional sense. They're image concepts, which is a collocation of words that they don't use, but that is present in virtually everything they write. Anyhow, this book is not composed of chapters, but of plateaus. So today one can laugh. I can say they're bluffing. They're doing some sort of this is not a finger, but it's not pointing at anything either. So what is it? Show me the sound of one hand clapping. Show me the show me a book with no chapters in it. We try to explain further on why, and also why the texts are dated. So the texts are dated except for the introduction, which has a number, it has 1, but it doesn't have a date, and it's introduction 1, introduction rhizome. In a certain measure, these plateaus can be read independently of each other, except the conclusion, which should be read only at the end. Well, they're pretty authoritarian there. I can get why you might not read the conclusion at the beginning, although it could alert you to a whole lot of vocabulary that you can, and what's important about it, orient your reading. So I don't see why not. It could be good to read it in the middle, once you start getting confused, in the middle, in a sort of open sense, as they talk about the middle as a sort of the growing point. So when you're at a growing point in your reading, you could read the conclusion, and it might help get things clearer for you. I've translated in a certain measure, where the English translation, totally correctly, says, I'm sorry, to a certain extent. I'll just verify that. It is composed not of chapters but of plateaus, in inverted commas. So for me, the inverted commas, as I explained, say, in fact, this is not a metaphor, but it's not literal either. Deterritorialize it. So I deterritorialized it in my own way and called these words, these keywords, image concepts. We'll try to explain why later on. To a certain extent. Okay, that's good. To a certain extent. I said, in a certain measure, dans une certaine mesure, because later on, fairly rapidly in this first chapter, Rhizome, the concept of the measure becomes very important. The concept of the measure, of things being measurable and quantifiable, and of things being not of the same measure, or qualitatively of different measures, so of incommensurable measures. So in a certain measure, these plateaus can be read independently. So it depends on what your measure is. If you're reading with the measure of interpretative coherence, or in relation to a single theme that you have isolated and you want to follow through in the book. You're not going to be able to read things as independently from each other as you can if you have a sort of measure or set of measures, a heterogeneous set of measures that come up as you read. I will suggest in my reading that these measures, one can take the form of criteria, and that the book is constantly proposing criteria and is constantly thus offering itself to being tested. These are these measures, amongst other things, or can be criteria of testability, and so we can constantly ask, are Deleuze and Guattari living up to their own measures, not to my measures or some external objective measures, but are they living up? It sounds really good. There's a sort of rhetoric that carries you along. There's all sorts of slogans. Don't make trees, make rhizomes. So that takes us back to rhizome. But is it true? Should we not make any trees? Can we? In fact, they say we can't avoid making trees. Make rhizomes. Are all rhizomes good? In fact, they say that many rhizomes are bad. So they say that they write rhizomatically, but is it true, and to what extent? The title is Rhizome, so it was an unusual title for a book of philosophy at that time. Nowadays, if we're at all interested in continental philosophy, even if we haven't read much, even if we've only heard of Deleuze and Guattari, we have at least a sort of vague idea of what a rhizome is, a sort of freestyle, things connect with other things. So, in fact, they spell out what a rhizome is in terms of 6 principles. I'd just like to remark that rhizome, what is the status? What is the grammatical status of the title? It seems it's not the rhizome, or in French, le rhizome. There's no article. Is it a pure noun? Is it a verb or an imperative? Rhizome, go and rhizome. Or is it some absolutely unmarked, neither noun nor verb, grammatical form? After, in the course of the book, they put up 6 principles: connection, heterogeneity, multiplicity, A signifying rupture, and 5 and 6, it's a little silly. It's one thing and its opposite. Cartography and the translators say decalcomania. So, as if that's a normal word in English. So, it is a fairly normal word in French. So, it's cartography versus tracings, or mappings versus tracings. So the real principle is number 5, cartography, and just 6 is just put on. They could easily have done that with the others: connection and deconnection, heterogeneity and homogeneity. So there's something funny with 5 and 6. It may be argued that 5 and 6 concern the meta level more so than the others, although A signifying rupture seems like a meta level category to me. So anyhow, they saw fit to baptize that 5 and 6 instead of just 5. So that's good. So if rhizome has a botanical sense, I think potatoes are rhizomes. So are potatoes growing in terms of connection, heterogeneity, multiplicity, A signifying rupture, mapping, and decalcomania? I don't think so. So they may claim their theoretical terms are not metaphors, but they're not literal either. They're deterritorialized terms, is what Deleuze calls it in quoting Guattari in dialogues. So an interesting thing, maybe I should comment on the names. I mean, I may well spend an hour just on the first, on the cover and on the first couple of pages. So Deleuze and Guattari, we're used to saying that now. In fact, that should already be a danger signal to us. This is a book about incommensurability, heterogeneity, and we're just used to saying, sort of like an incantation, Deleuze and Guattari. So, in their first book together, Anti-Oedipus, Deleuze and Guattari, that's a shock. That's a philosopher and a wild psychoanalyst coming together to write a book. I mean, probably it was done before, but given that they're sort of criticizing psychoanalysis in a really strong yet non-conservative fashion, there's a shock there. We have a shock of heterogeneity. So after, and I want to comment on that later, the next book, there are, as I said, a couple of articles that are sort of sketches or first versions for chapters in 1,000 Plateaus, notably how to make oneself a body without organs, one, two, or several wolves, and well, Rhizome itself was probably separately, but those two articles at least. The next book was Kafka, published in 1975, Deleuze and Guattari, and this could legitimately be called the sequel. They say in 1,000 Plateaus that what do they say? That this book, 1,000 Plateaus, is a sequel and the end for the capitalism and schizophrenia duology. So that's playing a bit fast and furious, or a bit loose. The sequel was Kafka. So here we have a philosopher and a psychoanalyst publishing a book on a literary writer, and then the year after, Rhizome. So the shock of heterogeneity is sort of already beginning to wear off, as far as I'm concerned. And this collaboration goes on 20 years. Why am I talking about that? Well, at the time, I don't know if anybody commented much on it. Deleuze has fun saying, oh yes, it's like Laurel and Hardy. People try and figure out which of the two is responsible for which passage, but we're both responsible for all the passages and so on. But after, I think, the last book, What is Philosophy, Badiou wanted to engaged in a philosophical correspondence with Deleuze in view of a book, I suppose, and this never came to fruition. And Badiou's idea was that, I'm sort of formulating it in my words, but it's not far from that Deleuze talks about heterogeneity, incommensurability, difference, divergence, and so on. But as Badiou says, the sort of dialogue, the sort of rhizomatic connection that Deleuze entered into was, if you have a wide enough look around, that is to say, if you look at Badiou as well, the type of connection or dialogue is a convergent one all the time. In particular, this collaboration, which lasted 20 years between Deleuze and Guattari. So their first, this is a criterion. The title is Rhizome. So you can say, to what extent are you writing rhizomatically, viewed from today? Maybe at the time that seemed like a really rhizomatic, or really radical collaboration. But now we know that it went on 20 years, and we know that Badiou tried to introduce a divergent dialogue, that is, not totally divergent, but more divergent or less convergent, and that it failed, that Deleuze broke off and forbade Badiou to publish anything of the correspondence, at least from his Deleuze's side. We can say, yes, if we want, in certain circumstances, we may take the rhizome, the rhizomatic method, because it's a methodology as well, as something that we want to implement, and we can take it as a criterion for judging our own thinking and the thinking of others. And so it's not an all or nothing. It's not a binary, either you're rhizomatic or you're not, or you're rhizomatic or you're tree-ish. It's a range of intensities. So just how rhizomatic are Deleuze and Guattari? Here, this is the third book in the collaboration. There may be a certain degree of commensurability, mutual commensurability coming up, and maybe they will comment on it. So I think we'll see, if we have that in mind, and the idea that to a certain extent, to a certain measure, things are either independent or not independent, are either continuous or discontinuous. We can try looking at the book through a variety of measures and see what we come up with. So I want to begin talking about the text now. In my version, there's a difference between the independent version of 1976 and the version that figures as the first chapter in 1,000 Plateaus. Maybe you can see it begins with page 7. That's the same in both cases. Then page 8, I've put a black corner. There's a passage straight away after the first paragraph. The second paragraph is not in the book, in the book 1,000 Plateaus. And this first difference or divergence is quite, goes all of one page, and it stops at the top of the next page, page 9, and the rest a book has no object nor subject is the actual second paragraph in 1,000 Plateaus. So that's a long paragraph and a fairly important one that they left out, and it fits in with the considerations that I've been giving. So I'm going to place a lot of weight on that. Maybe I'll keep that for next time. So it begins. We wrote Anti-Oedipus together. That's fine. How does Anti-Oedipus begin? I should have prepared the book. It begins, it is at work everywhere. It is at work everywhere, sometimes stopping, sometimes discontinuous. It breathes, it heats, it eats, it shits, it fucks. All pretty ordinary language. Maybe a little too ordinary for the criteria of the epoch. What an error to have called that the it or the id. Everywhere it's machines, but not at all metaphorically. So, Gilles and Felix, not metaphorically, but not literally either. Machines are machines. That's a case, when they say things like that, it's not metaphorical. That's, for me, a case of what they call anti-production. You're sort of producing, and the sense, as you read, and they intervene, and they say, it's not metaphorical. So that's an anti-production type of intervention, and anti-production we know can be helpful for asignifying ruptures, in fact, or it can be unhelpful, it can be counterproductive, if you want. So machines are machines with their couplings, their connections, an organ machine. Already they're going off on so they started with ordinary language, and already they're going off on their technical language of machines, and that seems to be what they do here. We wrote Anti-Oedipus together, as each of us was several. That made already a crowd. A lot of people. So they're talking in ordinary language, non-technical terms, but at the same time they're adding a non-ordinary idea that we're all crowds, whereas in Anti-Oedipus we're all machines. Is it so extraordinary today? I'll leave open the question, was it so extraordinary in 1976? But is it so extraordinary today to think of ourselves as a crowd of different sub-personalities? I don't know. It may still be news to some, but I find that it's less news now than it was then, if it was news then. Here we have used everything which came close to us, qui nous approchait, which came towards us, the closest and the farthest. So we're using things that come towards us, that come to hand, that we use things that are available for us to use, whether they're close, and here we can think in terms of measure and commensurability and incommensurability, or the furthest, things that you wouldn't ordinarily think that that we can use as philosophers or as psychoanalytically informed writers or whatever. So familiar stuff and surprising stuff. We have distributed clever pseudonyms to make unrecognizable. To make unrecognizable. There's no object given. To make us unrecognizable, to make them, the things or the people to which we've given pseudonyms, given that we ourselves are crowds, have we used pseudonyms for the conceptual characters that compose our own so-called identity, so as to make them unrecognizable? Why not? But then why? One reason of keeping things unrecognizable is to avoid domination, to avoid manipulation, to avoid the reader or others exploiting in some way the sources of our thinking and of our writing. Also, perhaps to heighten the effect. If you give all the names, everything becomes familiar and you're not going to get an incommensurable rupture. Everything is going to seem like a sort of rehash, a rearrangement, slightly novel rearrangement of the same thing. So that raises a question. Why have we kept our names? And several reasons are given. So why have we kept our names? Well, they have. They've signed it. Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. So, by habit, uniquely by habit. So they're using habitual language. That could be good for communication, and it could be an epistemological obstacle at a certain moment as well. So they're not going to talk in ordinary language using pseudonyms and masks and fake names all the time. They're going to come out, and fairly quickly they're going to come out of ordinary language and use technical vocabulary, which I don't think can be counted under the rubric of pseudonyms. So anyhow, one is out of habitude, out of our habit as writers, and out of respect for or taking into account of the habits of the readers, to make us unrecognizable in turn. So that suggests that when they were using pseudonyms, they were making other people or other types of characters unrecognizable, anonymous. They wanted to make them ultimately anonymous by using pseudonymous, explicitly self-avowed pseudonymous names, titles, expressions, to keep a part of the unknown within their style. And so by habit, to make ourselves unrecognizable, and third reason, to make imperceptible not ourselves but that which makes us or impels us to act, to experience, and to think. So, to make imperceptible. So we've said that there can be cunning against the ruses of power, being cunning, rusing ourselves, crafty, wary, and so on. All part of the resistance to a particular type of power that tries to know all about us and stick us in our place and keep us from moving around or making things fuzzy or blurry or allowing them to move around. But I think also this idea of the imperceptible sets up the notion of perception, and so of the, because we're talking about language here, of the observation language. So a certain way of thinking, and I think we're getting it here, and we'll get it again in the next paragraph that was cut out from the book version of 1,000 Plateaus. We're getting a certain sort of, they probably wouldn't like it if I said stratification, but we're getting a sort of set of degrees. We've got the habitual level, ordinary language, and sort of slightly modified, there is new content within habitual language. So saying that each of us was several and that together the two of us make a crowd, quite a crowd. They're talking in ordinary language, but they're giving a slightly non-ordinary content to it. Then we have the unrecognizable elements, and it's good that they're unrecognizable. If they're unrecognizable, it's because we're making already a first sort of a signifying rupture, an incommensurable leap, because the observation language, the habitual and language, or the language of perceptibility, ordinary perceptual language, is theory-laden itself, is caught in sort of the doxic presuppositions. And if we're going to say something new, if we're going to go further than this doxic or ideological level, we need things that are at least initially unrecognizable. And then there's this higher level of making imperceptible. So there's the unrecognizable, because to create change, including conceptual change, you need to intervene things from outside the habitual field. And then there's this higher level of imperceptibility, which is only relative. I mean, once you adopt the new theory, like with desiring machines, you see desiring machines all around you, but you didn't at first, and it seemed a little crazy at first. So this idea of being imperceptible may have an absolute element, but it also has a relative element. Okay, and they say the same thing again in ordinary terms. Already that's sounding a little, it's ordinary language, it's sounding a little strange. People going around saying, I want to be unrecognizable, and I want whatever is important to me to be imperceptible. It sounds a little paranoid, or a little, maybe a little aristocratic as well, a little elitist. I don't want people to see what my references and my coordinate systems are. I'm going to have a sort of an ordinary facade, a habitual language for ordinary people. Maybe there's some of that in it. And also, and then, because it's pleasant, or agreeable to speak like everybody and to say that the sun rises when everybody knows that that's just a manner of speaking. Okay, everybody today knows when you say the sun rises, it's just a manner of speaking. And I would say doubly so, because after Copernicus, we know, and Galileo, we know the sun doesn't rise, but the earth turns. So we keep the old observation language, but we have managed to subtract the cosmology that was behind it. So we might think, oh yeah, they're saying that we've had the Copernican revolution, so we now know it's not a geocentric universe, and that the Earth turns and the sun is still at the center of the solar system. But then they're running in towards the end of the 20th century. There's another level where we know that even that is not true. There's not this gravitational attraction. There's space-time curvature. Maybe there's another level after that. So we're stuck with maybe 3 levels there on the image of saying the sun rises. What's the equivalent for them? We wrote Anti-Oedipus together, the two of us. Nous avons écrit l'Anti-Oedipe à deux. What does it say in the English translation? The two of us wrote Anti-Oedipus together. The two of us wrote Anti-Oedipus together. That seems a little repetitious. So we wrote Anti-Oedipus together, the two of us. That's an ordinary way of speaking. It's pleasant, according to them, to talk like that, when in fact, if Deleuze or Guattari let themselves go, they would say, no, you realize it's far more complicated than that. There's a whole set of conditions and of influences and so on that went into the making of this book, and it would take me ages to explain to you how it actually came to be. Why not? So you cut things short, and at the same time, by explicitly calling attention to it, you're calling attention to the whole structure of the conceptual apparatus of the book. Just to give an idea, there's this paragraph, there's the paragraph on psychoanalysis and on objections, and after, very quickly, they say how the book is made of diversely formed matters. It's composed of lines and speeds. It's a machinic assemblage. It's a multiplicity. So that's the, for me, relatively to this book, the highest level of abstraction is multiplicity. A certain lower level of abstraction which dominated in Anti-Oedipus was machinic assemblage. That's one instantiation of what a multiplicity is, and us as individuals, in the case the authors of the book, are particular instantiations of machinic assemblages. So that's the common sense level, that's the perceptual level, but we don't understand what we perceive if we don't have operating behind what we perceive the concepts of machinic assemblage and the multiplicities, just as we don't understand what we see when we see the sunrise if we don't have behind our perception an idea of the Earth rotating and of privileged inertial systems in a curved space-time, for example. They emphasize this point again, not to arrive at the point where one no longer says I, but at the point where that no longer has any importance whether you say I or not. So you don't actually have to change the language. So for me, that's a relative point. Sometimes you do, and they do. They change it straight away after. They talk about multiplicities and machinic assemblages, but probably when Deleuze went to buy his baguette, he didn't say, I would like the extraction from the extensive multiplicity of the white flower condensed sunlight capitalist exploitation of the baguette assembly or whatever. No, he just says, I want a wholemeal baguette. So the language you use depends on the circumstances, and it's not a cop-out. He doesn't go home mumbling to himself, I'm ashamed I was obliged to use ordinary subject predicate sentences to get my baguette. As long as he knows what's going on and he has the concepts and the relevant interlocutors or conversational partners have the right concepts, that's enough. You can relax and use ordinary terminology, or you can find that it's in danger of misleading you, and then, as in a book of philosophy, like even a short one like this, you start using different language. We are no longer ourselves. Each will recognize his own. We have been helped or aided, aspired. In the translation, I think they say inspired, but we've been aspired. There's a certain sense, there's this idea of breaths and stuff that they get from Klosowski, and I think maybe that's behind the word aspired there. It's a little obscure. Why not translate it as inspired? Because you've got the spire, the breath root in it. But one of the things we are in our spoken and written voice and in our personality, we are a multiplicity or a crowd of voices and of breaths. So that seems to be part of this seemingly ordinary habitual type sentence. We've been helped, inspired or aspired, and multiplied. So multiplicity is a very important criterion. These are pluralist authors, and so it's a criterion for collaboration and maybe for friendship and interaction. If I am in relation, this might be the definition of toxic versus non-toxic relations. If I'm in relations that demultiply me, that unify me and assign me a fixed identity, that's quite toxic, potentially. And if I'm in relations and conversations and dialogues and collaborations, or just playing around with people who multiply me, that is the the opposite. What's the opposite of a toxic relationship? It's a detoxified. It's a healthy. It's a flourishing, fructifying relationship. So that's what I see going on in the first paragraph, which is the first page of the separate book. I find it very interesting. There's a break in the language, at least at the beginning. There's a break in the language they're using in relation to Anti-Oedipus. And I think they're already beginning to work on the fact that this whole terminology of the desiring machines was good for a rapid noetic shock effect, but it's not viable in the long term. And behind desiring machines, you have the concept of assemblage, which has two faces, a collective assemblage of enunciation and a machinic assemblage of desire, if you wish. So they're not the concept of desiring machine is deprioritized in this book, Rhizome, and in the book 1,000 Plateaus, because machines is still a too instantiated concept. Assemblages is more generic, and I would argue desire is at a too instantiated level, because we need the whole psyche, so we need becomings, which are conceptually prior to desire. Desire is too unifying, so potentially a toxic concept, desire, as machine is potentially, depends on how you use it, but machine is potentially a toxic concept in the sense that I defined it, that it's toxic if it unifies, in that sort of repressive sense of blanking out the real multiplicities. So we begin with a break with the language, a partial break with the language of the first page of Anti-Oedipus. And at the same time, we begin, the first sentence is, we wrote Anti-Oedipus together. So Rhizome is being presented as the sequel, first Rhizome and then 1,000 Plateaus, when it incorporates Rhizome into a larger structure, if I may use that word. It's presented as a sequel to Anti-Oedipus. And this is very strange, because the real sequel came out a year earlier, is Kafka. And as well, we begin Rhizome, the book and the chapter. Well, the first word is in fact the title of the chapter or of the book, Rhizome, and seems to come out of nowhere. Whereas in Kafka, the real sequel in my eyes, we get a definition straight away on the first page. So this is my first page. Maybe it's on the second page of the English translation. But the first sentence: how do we enter into the work of Kafka, or into Kafka's work? It's a rhizome, a burrow, or a system of burrows. And goes on and talks about the examples of the castle, the Hotel of America, and so on. And then it gives what amounts to a working definition of rhizome after this set of examples. So we will enter by any end, whatever, any end or edge or part. None of them is any better than any other. No entry or entrance has any privilege, even if it's almost an impasse, a narrow tube, a siphon, etc. We will seek only, or we will look for only what other points can be connected, the one by which we entered, by what corners or nodes and corridors one passes to connect the 2 points, what is the map of the rhizome, and how it is modified immediately if one enters by another point. So already in this book that came out a year before, the rhizome is a central and primary concept, and it gets a definition that is in fairly ordinary language. We don't straight away get the 6 principles of connection, heterogeneity, multiplicity, asignifying rupture, cartography, and decalcomania, but it's sort of there already. We connect things up, we even things that have nothing to do with each other, so connection and heterogeneity. Multiplicity is sort of implicitly present. Asignifying rupture, not so much for the moment. The cartography is there. We're trying to make the map of the rhizome. How it modifies itself immediately if we enter by another point, that could be the rupture, the asignifying rupture. That sort of modification means that there are incommensurable maps of the same, between scare quotes, same rhizome or system of burrows. The principle of multiple, so here we have multiplicity. The principle of multiple entrances prevents alone the introduction of the enemy, the signifier, and the attempts to interpret a work which proposes itself, in fact, as experimentation. So there already, with the Kafka book, you're getting what could, if you were not watchful, could be interpreted as a sort of prohibition. Don't interpret, experiment. When in fact interpretation is or can be a form of experimentation. Anyhow, I'm going to wrap up here. I've done officially just the title and the first page or the first paragraph of Rhizome, but I brought in all sorts of other considerations. So I've proceeded rhizomatically. So I hope I've introduced a level of real multiplicity that is present, as far as I'm concerned, in this first paragraph.